I didn't lose everything at once. There wasn't one specific day when everything fell apart. There wasn't a mistake big enough to make me stop. What destroyed me was something small, repeated, silent, almost invisible. While I believed I was in control, something was growing behind the scenes of my routine. Without noise, no warning, no rush. This is not a story about wealth, not even about sudden bankruptcy. It's a story about excessive comfort, automatic trust, and the danger of ceasing to monitor when everything seems to be working. I only realized it too late. And when I realized, I was no longer in control. Today there is no loud music filling the room or distracting my thoughts. There is no rush pushing decisions or quickening the pace of my breathing. There is only silence, calm, constant, almost too comforting. A type of silence that doesn't frighten, but gradually dulls the senses. At that moment, I deeply believed that everything was exactly in its place. Nothing seemed out of control. Nothing seemed about to crumble before my eyes. I truly believed I was safe within my own routine. My life appeared stable from every angle I looked at it. The bills were always paid on time, with no noticeable delays. The calendar continued to move forward without surprises, as if following a predictable script. The work was productive, the tasks were completed, and the results seemed sufficient. The smile came easily, almost automatically, even when no one was looking. There were no alarms, no obvious signs that anything was wrong. Nothing drew enough attention to interrupt the flow of the days. I was walking on autopilot, repeating habits without questioning their consequences. The routines were repeated with precision, like a cycle that fed on itself. I trusted the numbers, the statements, and the silent notifications from the bank. I also trusted in my own ability to keep everything under control. This confidence grew without limits and began to take up too much space. Without realizing it, trust turned into constant noise in my conscience. A low, persistent noise that's easy to ignore once you get used to it. There was no sudden shock capable of waking me up. There was no visible crisis that required immediate decisions. There was no clear warning indicating that something needed to change. What existed was simply continuity. Days following one another, without surprises, without apparent falls, without immediate losses. The months passed with the same appearance of normality, a long, silent, and dangerously comfortable calm. This calmness began to lull me into a false sense of security. She made me relax when I should have been paying closer attention. She made me compromise on small details that seemed harmless. Small habits crept into our routine without asking permission. Small choices became permanent without me even realizing it. Nothing seemed wrong at the time these decisions were made. Nothing seemed big enough to warrant concern. I breathed a sigh of relief every day, believing that I had control of the situation. I thought I had enough control to deal with any unforeseen future events. I thought I had the leeway, space, and time to correct any deviation. I thought time was on my side, always available. Time seemed infinite when observed from within the apparent stability. The surveillance decreased without me even realizing it. Care, too, was quietly fading away step by step. Danger didn't knock on the door announcing its arrival in a dramatic way. He simply sat down next to me, like someone I knew. He remained silent, observing each repeated choice. Disguised as normal without raising immediate suspicions. Disguised as comfort without causing any discomfort. Disguised as routine, precisely where I least expected it. And I didn't realize when he became a part of my life. This story begins right here, before any visible fall, before fear became constant and occupied my thoughts, before shame emerges as a burden difficult to explain. It begins in the silence that I mistook for true peace. It begins with a trust that has become blind over time. It begins with the absence of oversight when everything seemed to be working. It starts with me believing I was completely in control. Over time, that feeling of stability became part of my identity. I presented myself to the world as someone organized, responsible, and predictable. Nothing seemed to deviate from the plan I believed I had created. The days began and ended in the same way, without any surprises. This constant repetition gave me a false sense of control. I used to confuse routine with control, consistency with security, and that made me too comfortable. Wake up, work, pay bills, consume, repeat. This cycle seemed healthy as long as everything was working. I no longer analyzed the details, I just followed along. I trusted that the system would adjust itself. Each small decision seemed irrelevant in isolation. Nothing seemed capable of causing a real imbalance. I kept believing that everything was under control. There were discrete signs scattered along the way. Minor delays that I easily overlooked. Small justifications that sounded too reasonable. Nothing screamed danger, only whispered caution. But I wasn't listening carefully. I preferred the comfort of apparent normality. Asking questions seemed unnecessary at that moment. I kept telling myself it was just a phase. What adjustments would be made later if necessary? The important thing was to keep life flowing. These thoughts temporarily reassured me. It was easier to accept ready-made explanations. It's easier to postpone decisions to another time. It's easier to continue than to stop and revise. Comfort began to guide my choices. I avoided any feeling of immediate discomfort. I chose the path that required the least mental effort. I didn't want to open spreadsheets or review my habits. All of this seemed excessive for a stable situation. I used to believe that control meant the absence of tension, and not a need for constant attention. The false sense of security fed on predictability. As long as nothing was falling apart, I relaxed more. As long as nothing hurt, I ignored the internal warnings. I used to believe that problems would always arrive with a bang. I never imagined they would arrive in complete silence. Comfort blinded me to the growing risk. And I didn't realize this blindness. Each day reinforced the illusion of stability. Each month validated my past decisions. I used the recent past as proof of control. If it worked before, it should continue to work now. This thought was repeated without being questioned. The false sense of security was becoming increasingly solid, and I leaned on her without realizing how fragile she was. It was in this scenario that the invisible error began, not as a shock, but as a habit. Something small, recurring, and seemingly harmless. Something that didn't seem to deserve immediate attention. Something easy to justify within a comfortable routine. I still didn't see any danger there, but he was already in motion. It wasn't one big decision that changed everything at once. There was no dramatic moment that warranted immediate attention. It was something small, repetitive, almost too automatic. A simple habit, easy to ignore when isolated. Something that seemed to solve problems, not create them. Something that spared me discomfort at that moment. I didn't see that as a mistake. This habit became part of our routine as a practical solution. He made daily life easier without raising suspicion. He was discreet, quiet, and seemingly controllable. It didn't require much reflection or difficult choices. It seemed like just a way to keep everything running. Nothing indicated that it carried a hidden cost. Nothing indicated a future problem. I kept telling myself it was temporary, which would be easy to adjust later if necessary. That other people did the same without consequences. These comparisons gave me momentary peace of mind. The habit repeated itself without internal resistance. Repetition made everything seem more normal, and what was considered normal ceased to be questioned. Each repetition seemed to confirm that everything was all right. No immediate punishment appeared to warn me. No visible losses were emerging to cause concern. The silence reinforced the feeling of security, and I was confusing the absence of pain with the absence of risk. The mistake thrived, protected by the lack of consequences. It was growing slowly, out of my field of vision. The problem wasn't the isolated incident. It was the frequency with which he became necessary. It was the ease with which I could turn to him. It was the immediate relief he offered. This relief prevented me from seeing the real impact. I prioritized the present and postponed the future, without realizing the weight gain. Over time, the habit ceased to be an exception. It became part of the normal functioning of my life. I no longer planned without considering that feature. He was always there, available and silent. The feeling of control came from this availability. I thought having access meant being in charge, and that illusion kept me comfortable. I didn't talk about it with anyone, not out of shame, but because it seems irrelevant. It was too small a deal to become a big deal, something that didn't deserve outside attention. The silence reinforced the normalization of the habit, and the habit grew stronger in that silence. It grew without being challenged. That is how the invisible error became entrenched. Without fanfare, without drama, without internal resistance. He blended into the routine as if it were natural. I still felt safe and confident. I still believed that everything was under control. I didn't know the remote control was already starting to leak, drain slowly but steadily. At first, the feeling of control remained intact. I believed I was simply using a convenient tool. Nothing seemed out of place when I glanced at it quickly. The numbers still made sense at first glance. The routine continued without major interruptions. I saw no reason for immediate concern. Everything seemed under control, at least superficially. As time went by, something slowly began to change. The margin that once existed has become narrower. Small adjustments became necessary more frequently. I noticed, but I avoided dwelling on that discomfort. I preferred to believe it was just a passing phase. Accepting that explanation was more comfortable. Questioning would require attention and confrontation. The pressure began to build quietly. It wasn't an overwhelming weight, but a constant tension, a feeling that I was always compensating for something. I adjusted one stitch to cover another, always putting out small, invisible fires. Nothing exploded, but everything required more energy. I felt tired without understanding why. Denial became my main defense. I avoided looking deeply into the situation. Avoiding it seemed like a way to stay calm. The less I analyzed, the less anxious I felt. I chose the immediate relief of ignorance. I believed that awareness would only bring worry, and that kept me still. Justifications began to emerge easily. I always found a plausible reason to continue. Nothing seemed serious enough to warrant a sudden change. I used to say that it was normal to go through that everyone was going through similar phases. These phrases calmed me down temporarily, and they postponed any real action. The habit that once seemed neutral was now necessary. I was counting on him to maintain the appearance of stability. Without it, small cracks would begin to appear. This dependency gave me a false sense of control. I thought that mastering the resource was the same as being confident. I didn't realize that I was already being guided by him. The direction had changed without me noticing. Gradually, I stopped planning calmly. Everything was calculated to survive in the short term. The future was relegated to the back burner without warning. I was just focused on getting through the month. This change in mindset went unnoticed, but it eroded the foundation of true control, and I still wouldn't admit it. The loss of control didn't happen all at once. It was spread out in small daily concessions. Each one seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a weight that was difficult to bear. I wasn't on the verge of collapse yet, but it was already slowly slipping, and he pretended not to feel the ground shifting beneath him. The collapse didn't come with a visible bang for others to see. He arrived after sleepless nights and repetitive thoughts. It surfaced as silent worries that I hid during the day. My body felt it before my mind accepted it. The tranquility I was pretending to have no longer existed. Everything seemed to work on the outside, but not on the inside, and that started to wear me down deeply. The consequences began to appear discreetly. They weren't alarming numbers, they were constant feelings. There's some tension when opening simple notifications, a tightness in my chest when I think about the end of the month. I used to avoid looking at details that were once considered natural. Fear mingled with routine without asking permission, and I pretended that nothing was happening. Money began to occupy more space in my mind, not as a plan, but as an ongoing concern. I thought about him when I woke up and before I went to sleep. Even so, he avoided facing the full reality. It was as if looking directly at it made everything definitive. I preferred living in controlled uncertainty, even though it was consuming me. Emotions began to get mixed up. Shame, fear, and anxiety alternated in silence. I didn't talk about it with anyone. He maintained the appearance of normalcy at all costs. Smile during conversations while your mind is elsewhere. The internal disconnect grew stronger each day, and the emotional exhaustion kept piling up. The collapse wasn't just financial. He directly gained my personal trust. I began to doubt my own decisions. I was questioning past choices too late. I felt I had lost something that was difficult to define. It wasn't just about money, it was about internal security, and that hurt in a silent way. The feeling of control has almost completely disappeared. I could no longer predict with any peace of mind. Everything seemed fragile, even when it was stable. Instability has become a permanent emotional state. I lived in a constant state of alert, even without an explicit crisis. The body reacted as if the danger were immediate, even when nothing was happening. I started to realize that something had broken. It wasn't a specific moment, it was a slow realization. That small habit had created a real burden. Now he demanded space, energy, and peace. The cost that was previously invisible has become clear, and it was no longer possible to ignore it. The collapse had happened from the inside. It was at this point that the bottom started to appear, not like a sudden abyss, but like solitude, a feeling of being trapped inside myself, without knowing exactly how to get out of that situation. I was still functioning, but without any clear hope. The weight was steady and silent, and I started to isolate myself. Rock bottom wasn't a physical place. It was an emotional state that was difficult to explain. I was still leaving the house. I was still keeping to a schedule. But inside, something was completely drained. The power went out without warning. Everything required too much effort, even the simplest tasks. Shame began to take up too much space. Not a public shame, but an internal one. I felt responsible for that situation, and that made me avoid deep conversations. I answered everything with short sentences. I would change the subject whenever possible. I preferred silence to the risk of exposing myself. I started to distance myself from people, not out of lack of affection, but out of fear. Fear of questions that are too simple. Fear of appearing weak or disorganized. I made excuses not to be there. Isolation seemed like a form of protection, even though it leaves me more alone. The nights became too long. The tired body couldn't rest. The mind kept repeating scenarios and possibilities. I silently relived old decisions. I was thinking about what I should have done differently, but these thoughts offered no solution. They only increased the emotional burden. I felt like I had failed myself. This feeling was constant and difficult to shake off. There was no external villain to blame. There was no specific crisis to justify it. There were only small, accumulated choices, and the belated recognition of that. The lowest point was accepting that. I even avoided looking to the future. Thinking ahead caused immediate discomfort. It was easier to just focus on the next day. Surviving the present moment seemed enough. Dreams and plans became distant, not because they died, but because they hurt. I needed to regain my footing first. At that point, the loneliness became evident. Even surrounded by people, I felt alone. Nobody knew what was really going on, and I didn't know how to explain it. Silence became a constant companion. It was no longer comfortable. It was heavy and tiring. It was there that something slowly began to change. Not as a solution, but as awareness. An honest account of what had happened. No excuses, no external justifications. I started admitting it to myself. Something needed to be faced, even without knowing how yet. The change didn't begin with an elaborate plan. It began with a moment of quiet honesty. I stopped running away from the thoughts that bothered me. I stopped putting off facing reality. It wasn't comfortable, nor was it immediately liberating. It was simply necessary, and profoundly human. For the first time, I looked at the situation without filters. No ready-made excuses to alleviate the guilt. No comparisons to worse stories. I saw the scene as it truly was. Limited, fragile, and a direct consequence of repeated habits. This clarity hurt more than the denial, but it also brought something different. Accepting did not mean agreeing with what happened. It meant ceasing to fight against the facts. I understood that denying it only prolonged the damage. Resisting reality consumed energy. Acceptance brought a strange calm. Not complete peace, but a less heavy silence. I stopped calling myself unlucky. I stopped looking for someone to blame outside of myself. It seemed cruel to assume full responsibility, but it was also the first concrete step. No drama, no self-punishment, simply acknowledging the journey so far. And from the choices made, consciousness came with its limitations. I realized I didn't have complete control. How much of my sense of security was an illusion? This realization did not weaken me. She put me back on the ground, where things are real and where change is possible. I started to name the problem, not out loud, but internally. Giving it a name took away some of the power of fear. He transformed chaos into something observable, something that could be approached gradually. No false urgency, no unrealistic promises. Acceptance also brought grief. I mourned the version of myself that I believed I was, based on the security I thought I had built, because of decisions that wouldn't be reversed. I allowed myself to feel that loss, no rush to overcome it, without pretending it didn't hurt. It was in this space of awareness that something opened up, not an immediate solution, but a new willingness to change, not to get rich, not to prove anything to anyone, but to regain real control, even if it was little by little. The fresh start didn't come with enthusiasm or motivational phrases. He started discreetly, almost timidly. No grand promises or unrealistic expectations. I wasn't looking to turn the game around quickly. I was just trying to stop losing. This was already a significant step forward, and it demanded more presence than courage. The first steps were deliberately small. I needed to slow down so I wouldn't sabotage myself. No radical changes or impulsive decisions. I had already learned the cost of that. The focus wasn't on growth, it was on stabilization. It wasn't about winning more. It was about controlling better. This change of focus was essential. I started looking again at details that I had ignored, not with anxiety, but with attention. I observed without immediate judgment, like someone studying unfamiliar territory. No rush to build something new, just understanding where he was stepping and where he could no longer set foot. I've learned to live with minor inconveniences. Not running away from them was a daily exercise. Some decisions required resignation, others required patience. None of this was enjoyable at first, but he was honest, and that made a difference. Control began to return subtly, not as a feeling but as a practice. I stopped relying solely on impressions. I came to rely on constant observation. The habit that used to harm me has lost its power, not because it disappeared, but because it stopped being automatic. I didn't talk about success during that period. He was talking about consistency, repeating the basics even without motivation, in accepting good days and bad days, without dramatizing either of them. The balance didn't seem impressive, but it was real. Starting over taught me something important. Control is not the absence of problems. It is a continuous state of attentiveness. It's about knowing where the limits are, and respect them even when no one is watching. This learning experience did not bring euphoria. It brought true stability. I was still far from any ideal, but it wasn't falling anymore. The floor was no longer as slippery as before. There was room to breathe again. No illusions of absolute security. No rush to get anywhere. Just proceeding with more awareness. Today, when I look back, I don't see a clear villain. There wasn't a single major mistake worthy of headlines. What existed was a small, constant habit, something that seemed harmless while it was being repeated. He didn't destroy everything at once. He just gradually eroded control, and I let it happen. I learned that danger rarely arrives shouting. Most of the time, he arrives silently. It disguises itself as normality and comfort. It settles where no one questions it. It thrives in the absence of attention, and it gets stronger when everything seems to be working. That's how it was for me. For a long time, I confused tranquility with security. I confused routine with real stability. I confused absence of pain with absence of risk. These mix-ups proved costly, not in a single moment, but on many seemingly ordinary days, days that I didn't review. This story isn't about losing everything. It talks about losing control without realizing it. It talks about believing too much in one's own perception, and to monitor one's own habits too little. The impact wasn't just financial. It was emotional, silent, and profound. And it took a while for him to be recognized. Today I understand that control is not a feeling. It's continuous practice, even when it's tiring. It's about looking closely at what seems small. It's about not becoming complacent when everything is calm. It's about knowing that too much comfort can be a bad sign. Not successful, but it's a distraction. There is no perfect ending to this story. There is only conscious continuity. There is a silent commitment not to blindly repeat the same mistakes, to observe, adjust, and respect limits. No grand promises, no illusions of absolute security, by attendance only. If this story stayed with me, that's why. Because it doesn't end with a spectacular victory. It ends with renewed focus, with respect for the process, with humility in the face of one's own limitations, and with the certainty that vigilance matters, even when everything seems to be under control. That was the hardest and most honest lesson. It didn't come early, it didn't come easy, but it came at the right time, and it changed the way I look at life, not afraid, but consciously.